Jesus is sentenced to death. Let's take a look. All right, welcome back. Today we continue our study in Luke as we come to chapter 23. Let's begin, verse 1. Then the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Following the trial before the Sanhedrin in chapter 22, Jesus has now been unjustly convicted of blasphemy, a crime punishable by death. That said, the Romans at this time did not grant the authority to the Jews to carry out the execution of criminals. So as it states in the text, they brought Jesus before Pilate. Pilate was a Roman official in charge of the Judean region. History testifies of his cruel and callous approach to ruling. Surely these accusers had expected this to be an easy trial and a fast track to achieving their goal, Jesus' death. That said, with Pilate being a Roman rather than Jewish official, he would have little concern over their charge of blasphemy. If they hoped to see their goal met, they would need to accuse him of something relevant to Roman authority. And so they accused Jesus of 3 offenses. First, they state that he was misleading the nation of Israel. That is to say that he was acting as some form of a revolutionary, stirring up dissent. Second, they accused him of forbidding them to pay taxes to Caesar. This was blatantly false, of course, as we recently covered in our study of Luke chapter 20. Even though he was directly asked, he didn't forbid even his followers from paying their taxes. Instead, he commanded them to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Thirdly, they accused Jesus of acclaiming himself to be a king, which would place him in opposition to Caesar. In other words, they were accusing him to the Romans of being the kind of Messiah they had expected. A military revolutionary who would overthrow Rome and sit on the throne of Israel as king. Jesus, however, throughout his ministry, actively avoided and denied that this was his approach or his goal. He was their Messiah, but his goal was to overthrow the tyrannical reign of sin and death, not the Roman authorities. Verse 3. So Pilate asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him and said, "It is as you say." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they kept on insisting, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place." When Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself was in Jerusalem at that time. As we studied previously in John's account of this conversation, Jesus indicated that he was indeed a king, but not of this world. His kingship extends far beyond mere physical ambitions or rule. Pilate, after questioning Jesus and considering the responses he was given, drew his conclusion: "I find no guilt in this man." As mentioned earlier, Pilate was notorious for his cruelty. Had he detected or discerned any truth to the claims of the accusers, he wouldn't have hesitated to take action upon it. His conclusion and assertion was that Jesus was innocent of any wrongdoing. Taking it a step further, even he doesn't simply declare Jesus to be not guilty of their accusations. He declared that whether in the accusations of those present or otherwise, he could find no guilt within him. Not only was Jesus innocent of their accusations, he was innocent of any wrongdoing at all. Of all people, Pilate was even able to discern as much, despite being as morally corrupt as he was. The people, however, in their persistence and unwillingness to accept this decree, pushed harder, claiming that he was stirring up the people in Judea, Galilee, and even to Jerusalem. In the midst of the protesting from the crowd, the mention of Galilee draws the attention of Pilate, prompting him to send Jesus to Herod. Verse 8. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there, accusing him vehemently. Throughout the Gospels, we see many instances of individuals wanting to see Jesus, and for an array of reasons, no less. In Herod's case, while he was glad to see Jesus, it wasn't because he wished to learn from him, to follow him, or even to earnestly examine him. His gladness was rooted in his desire to see Jesus perform signs. Herod wasn't interested in Jesus as a teacher or the Messiah, much less being the Son of God. He was simply interested in the miracles. This was a hope that would go unfulfilled. Jesus easily could have convinced Herod of his power by doing just as Herod had wished, working some sign or miracle, but instead he made no argument on his own behalf, miraculous or otherwise. One can imagine some sense of disappointment in Herod's mind, having heard of Jesus time and time again and expecting tremendous wonder workings to prove who he was. Yet the greatest sign was still to come. Even as Jesus would soon be sentenced and crucified, he would also soon rise again from the grave. Verse 11. And Herod, with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they had been enemies with each other. Herod's reaction to Jesus' refusal to entertain him with miracles and signs was to mock him and treat him with contempt, even placing a robe upon him as if to mock his claim of kingship before sending him back to Pilate. Herod and Pilate, as the text states, were now unified as friends, though they had previously been enemies. Unfortunately, they were unified not by some noble cause or reason, but by their contempt and hatred of Jesus. In self-examination, what drives us to seek after Jesus? Are we simply seeking his blessings or even miracles in our lives as if to view him as some sort of spiritual genie? Or are we seeking him out of a devotion to his lordship and sovereignty in our lives? Are we seeking Jesus for who he is or only for what he can do? Herod was so caught up in his desire to see Jesus perform signs that he missed the hour of his visitation. We would not be wise to do the same. Verse 13. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us. And behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore, I will punish him and release him." Pilate reiterates to the crowd once again his belief that Jesus was innocent. Furthermore, he emphasizes that this conclusion wasn't drawn hastily. Not only had he come to this conclusion, but also, as he points out to the chief priests and the rulers who were present, so did Herod. This speaks volumes, especially considering the history of both rulers' brutal approach to their reign. Pilate was known for snuffing out insurrections or challenges to power at the very moment that they were detected. Yet both were insistent that Jesus should not be put to death, but rather punished in an effort to satisfy the crowd's bloodlust and then released. Unfortunately, as we'll soon see, in the face of the crowd's unrest, he was unwilling to stand by that conviction. Verse 17. Now he was obliged to release to them at the feast one prisoner. But they cried out all together, saying, "Away with this man, and release for us Barabbas." He was one who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept on calling out, saying, "Crucify, crucify him." At that time, a custom existed for one prisoner to be released to the people at Passover. Pilate's suggestion was for Jesus to be that prisoner released to them on that year, possibly not out of some sense of compassion for Jesus, but in an effort to quell the stirring unrest. The Jewish leadership had already rejected Jesus, so this appeal was directed toward the people. In some ways, Pilate was likely hoping that they would call for Jesus' release so that he could release him without worry of the consequences. The crowd, however, refuses to accept this outcome, calling for Barabbas, a man imprisoned for insurrection and murder, to be released instead. With some sense of tragic beauty, this exemplified what Jesus would soon fully accomplish on our behalf by way of his death on the cross. He was innocent, but being punished, while we, the guilty, are released. He was righteous in every way, yet that righteousness was exchanged for our sinfulness. Verse 22. And he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has this man done? I have found in him no guilt demanding death. Therefore, I will punish him and release him." But they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified. And their voices began to prevail. And Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand be granted. On Jesus' part, not even a flogging as brutal or intense as what that of the Romans was enough to satisfy the desire of the people. As they cry out, "Crucify, crucify him." The scene is almost too backward to picture. A Roman ruler known for his brutality and cruelty is begging the crowd to spare the life of this man who, not but a week prior, had been welcomed into Jerusalem with joyful praise. The same ones who were just crying, "Hosanna," were now crying, "Crucify." But their hearts and their minds were made up. They had rejected their Messiah and were now calling for his death. As their voices began to prevail, Pilate, being unwilling to stand by his conviction of Jesus' innocence, finally relented and allowed their demands of crucifixion to be carried out. Verse 25. And he released the man they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but he delivered Jesus to their will. At their request, the murderer was now released into their midst, and Jesus was delivered to the will of the people. In many ways, the crowd and their cries are reflective of sinful humanity. Apart from the working of Christ in our lives, we seek to embrace sinfulness rather than righteousness. We call for evil to be declared as innocence and true innocence to be punished instead. Again, apart from Christ, we would rather cling to our wickedness rather than submitting to the Lord. But thankfully, when we do choose to surrender to him, we can be released from bondage and washed clean and set free from the power of sin. Our appetites and attitudes can be changed, transformed, and transferred from that of rebellion against God, calling for the severing of his presence in our lives, to that of seeking to be obedient to his will for us. In the next episode, we'll be completing chapter 23 as Jesus bears the cross to Calvary, dies in our place on the cross, serves as the perfect sacrifice, and is buried, awaiting the time of his resurrection. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to stay up to date as we continue studying together. Thanks for watching.